over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey. This statement, made on the eve of World War I, was a profound description of the changes Sir Edward saw coming. And it wasn't just Sir Edward. Even though the last 1,000 years had seen wars continually in some part of Europe or another, and sometimes all of it at once, there was an overriding sense that this time, this war, was different. It's a familiar feeling to us now in 2025. There's a cloud hanging overhead that lets us know the world order as we know it is changing momentously and irreversibly. Like Sir Edward, we don't know yet how this will all turn out, for better or for worse. And the unknown is simply terrifying. The long 20th century was a miraculous time. Great evils were certainly done, but it was also a time of advances at a rate never experienced before in human history. From human rights to greater prosperity to medical advances to science, inconceivable 100 years ago. More was accomplished than even those of us living through those years could have ever imagined. And it all started with World War I, the Great War, the war that extinguished the lights. Perhaps now would be a very good time to look back at what changes the death and carnage brought. It's a bit of a misdirection to say that World War I actually brought those enormous societal changes into being. Certainly, the earliest years of the 20th century, as well as the end of the 19th, were already ushering in enormous advances. Humans were taking their first successful leaps into the sky. Women were agitating for their rights. The X-ray had been invented, as had the motor car. There was pushback against the rigid societal behavior code at that time. What World War I did was fast track everything that was already occurring and make it permanent. In effect, society was already heading in a particular direction. World War I just cemented those changes. It didn't create them. Europe before 1914 was governed by the great powers, who were engaged in various imperialistic schemes and talked amongst themselves to make sure that they were each checks and balances against the others. Nations who were not a part of the great powers weren't really in the calculation other than a sort of door prize of labor and commodities. The great powers decided amongst themselves, and the lesser nations were forced to go along. Nowhere is this better illustrated than in the partitions of Poland, which began in 1772. Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Prussia began to divvy up the nation without regard to how the Poles living there actually felt about it all. They wanted bulwarks against each other. The opinion of the nation whose land they were taking mattered not at all in the calculation. It's a situation that may sound familiar to inveterate news watchers today. But as the guns of August 1914 drew closer, the strength of the great powers was waning. The Ottoman Empire was openly known as the sick man of Europe, past its prime and losing ground to emerging nationalist groups. Although it was a Russian czar who had actually coined the dismissive term for the Ottomans, the Russian Empire was also faltering. The distance between the haves and the have-nots would have made even Marie Antoinette blush at Versailles. As well, the vaunted Russian power was just not as good as their press. When they fought 20th century wars, they lost. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, too, was faltering. Although their rigid court etiquette and penchant for uniform nobility was always front and center, It was a glittering facade. Truthfully, the empire had more Slavs than any other ethnic group, and these Slavs, as well as other minority ethnicities, were getting restless. They wanted self determination, and urged on behind the scenes by the Russians, were demanding their various homelands. Below the national level, women were increasingly demanding entrance to schools and jobs, and the vote. A largely agrarian world was swiftly industrializing and moving to cities. The urbanizing population was often still incredibly poor, but now could see the new wonders that were available with a bit of coin in the pocket. They wanted them too. And so labor movements and international communism were making inroads. And then the guns began firing. Millions of young men were sent to the front, but the homeland still needed to continue to turn out the factory products of war, and women were called upon to step up to that plate. Far from fainting, crying, or being useless in the face of hard work, women instead astounded their most strident naysayers by being competent. New jobs meant fashions had to change in order to accommodate the necessary work. Hemlines became shorter. Some women even began to wear trousers. Hair became shorter to make it more manageable and to keep it from getting caught in machinery. Shortages in cloth urged the shorter hemlines on, and after the war, when cloth was again available and abundant, hemlines never came back. In the first battles of the war, the casualties were treated much as they had been previously. Removal from the front meant a bumpy wagon ride that exacerbated the damage of the wounds. Infection was rampant. Wounds to arms and legs meant, more often than not, amputation rather than treatment. But war brought together recent advances and then amplified them. Soon, an ambulance corps of motor vehicles was developed. X-ray machines had been invented, but Marie Curie helped make them mobile so that doctors could locate bullets and shrapnel and remove it successfully. Nitrous oxide began to be used for anesthesia. Antiseptics were perfected so that by the end of the war, the amputations were no longer mainly attributable to infection. And blood banks, an idea we now take for granted, were invented when Captain Oswald Robertson realized that a stockpile of blood could be created using new methods to keep blood from clotting. Blood typing was known by this time and made transfusions even more safe and successful. A war benefits medicine more than it benefits anybody else. It's terrible, but it does, said Mary Merritt Crawford, the only female doctor at the American hospital in World War I. Another enormous change to the world was the role of government. Governments had always taxed. They'd always waged war. They'd always handled criminal proceedings and complaints and made laws. But now, governments were becoming intimately involved in daily life. In previous wars, militaries would commandeer food and fuel as needed. Some governments made attempts to offer compensation, but when the fighting was bad enough, all that fell by the wayside. What was needed was taken. Government contracts reflected that reality. But in World War I, a war with more mass communication than ever before, things were changing. People were demanding the governments do something and were willing to be told what the government would do. As a result, in the United States, an entire new department came into effect that regulated food and fuel consumption through mass social pressure and legal means. In previous eras, people would buy what they could afford out of what was available, and skyrocketing prices in emergencies reflected that. Now, there were legal requirements for what was allowed to be consumed. Wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Mondays became accepted. And the government also instituted laws fixing prices. The new reach in government regulation of citizens' everyday lives was unprecedented. And it didn't go away at the war's end. In fact, many citizens welcomed the government push into their lives. Everything was changing so much, so quickly, that they wanted someone to help them navigate the new world. Nor was everyone happy with the changes. As the middle and working class became more prominent on the national stages, the upper classes were losing control. In the case of the Bolsheviks in Russia, it wasn't merely a loss of physical control and wealth, it was also a loss of lives, and they were ugly, ugly deaths. All of the various progress made in different areas came together in the fighting, and in turn created more progress as the deaths mounted. Communication methods, weapons, and legalities were all honed on the battlefield, and the effects of this spread throughout the world. The end of the war was an emotional split personality. It did not provoke enduring celebrations, but rather somber commemorations. Instead, the enormous trauma of the horrors that took root in those who lived them, and it was a splintered horror, to be sure, but all intended to prevent the next massive round of deaths. Some felt nationalism was the way to protect themselves through strength. Others turned to socialism and communism as a way to foster international ties above nationality, as well as to cut out the upper class and nobility who were blamed for the war. Still others turned to promoting peace through diplomacy, the genesis of the League of Nations. There was to be a new world order, a world where democracy kept the peace and where all nations had a voice, where progressive ideals could be put into place to help those who needed it most, and therefore tamp down resentments that led to slaughter. But not everyone was on board with that idea either. The biggest cheerleader of the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson, was unable to convince his own nation, the United States, to join. It's often attributed to an isolationist bent within an America protected by oceans, but it wasn't only that. Tangled alliances had created the problem, some thought. Best to not be beholden to others in the first place. We all desire peace, said Henry Cabot Lodge on the floor of the U.S. Senate. But in our zeal for peace, we must be careful not to create new obligations and new and untried conditions which may lead to war rather than fostering peace. It's an understanding we continue to forget through time, that sometimes by demanding peace, the wrong peace, we make war inevitable. It never ceases to amaze me that when my grandmother was born, women were not allowed to vote. When my grandmother died, a woman had served as Speaker of the House and one was gearing up to run for president. Women had been prime ministers of the UK, of India and Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Chancellor of Germany. Women had presided over the world's top corporations and had gone to space. My grandmother was born during World War I, in the opening days of flight. Before her death, she took commercial flights to 120 different countries and saw men walk on the moon. She lost her only brother to a tooth infection as a young child, but by the time her grandchildren were born, Not only were such infections a minor blip requiring penicillin during childhood, but smallpox had been eradicated. And children in the developed world were no longer falling prey to polio. She was born before household telephones and lived into the social media age. All of these changes were the result of what Virginia Gildersleeve, the only woman on the U.S. United Nations delegation in 1946, termed a New World Order. It's a loaded term, one that's been seized upon by numerous conspiracy theorists. But what it really means is this: everything changed, and the future was something unimaginable to those who lived before. Some people find it easier to define that change by saying there's an evil cabal behind it, maybe including the Rothschilds, the Gettys, and Colonel Sanders before he went tits up. That's more comforting, maybe, than the knowledge that events spiraled out of control, everything collapsed, and we rebuilt something new. It's happened before. Of course, with only about 15 minutes per History She Wrote episode, we can't really do more than just scratch the surface of the history that wrote the history we're living today. But what we can do is give you a place to start. Don't settle for an internet deep dive. Pull out history books, read interviews, and absolutely look at those maps. The past wrote the present, and the present writes the future. As Winston Churchill didn't actually say, but is actually true, history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it.
What to do?